Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here, and I want to talk about flippers. Very popular option on knives. Sometimes it feels like overdone in the sort of the industry. In fact, there are knives out there that have all possible opening options, right? They have a flipper, they have a thumb stud or a thumb disc, and they have a wave feature. And you sort of look at that and go, like, how many different ways do you need to open this knife? But the reality is, flippers are also, well, sometimes a little overdone, a lot of fun. They are a quick way to open a knife. And if you're like me and you will sit watching TV and, flip your knife open and close over and over again, they are also a lot of fun. Now, certain ones are better than others. And what I want to talk about is what makes them that way and what makes some flippers only mediocre and what makes some awesome. Okay, the Stedman ZKC or ZKC is reasonably good, reasonably fast and reliable, but it does have one weak point that we'll discuss. Something like this knife, still very fast, still very functional, but very different from a lot of the others that we've got here. This is the S35VN limited edition of the Buck 830 Marksman. Great knife. So what we want to talk about is, what makes it good, what makes it bad, what are we looking for, and what maybe would you want to look for in a flipper? What kind of sort of keywords do you want to focus on? And let's start with probably the most sort of critical aspect of this, and that is detent. So that is how firmly this blade is stuck in the handle, okay? And essentially, detent, line steel, you guys always ask, what knife are you showing? This is the line steel Kerr, but a good detent doesn't have to be extremely strong. This one's pretty stiff. What it needs to do is be strong enough that the force needed to overcome the detent is enough to get the blade to fly out of the handle promptly. Okay, that's basically what we're looking for. Some knives, let's see here. This WE 608 is a good example. The detent does meet that criteria, but it's so weak that you don't get a lot of you don't get a lot of speed and you don't get a really solid flipping action. It flips out and it's very, very smooth, like extremely smooth. But I could wish that the detent on this were just a little bit stiffer and you'd get a little bit more positive pop when you deploy the knife. Other examples would be this knife. Now, the detent on this is not very strong and it's not a bearing flipper, so there's a little more friction than, pretty well anything else that I've got here. And that means it needs a little wrist action. The action on this knife kind of reminds me of a hinderer, okay? It's just not as smooth, or just not as reliable of a flipping mechanism as you'd like it to be. So you need a little wrist action. This is a 0 tolerance 0-200. So when we talk about detent, what we're basically looking for is the force required to get that detent ball to break loose, okay, is enough to get the blade to fly out with a fair amount of force. Okay, now I'm going to use my hands here for a second to kind of explain detent. If you look at the inside of a lock bar on pretty well almost any knife that functions the way that functions with a detent ball, you'll see a little ball protruding out of the inside of the frame lock here. And that ball, okay, imagine my hand is the ball, here's the blade, it kind of comes halfway through the blade like this. That ball pops into a little recess in the blade, okay? And so you can see that there's going to be some amount of holding, but because everything is rounded, it will slide out of there, okay? It just needs the lock bar to pop over a little bit. That's why, by the way, if you have a knife that is really hard to flip, I'm pushing on the lock bar right now, so I'm holding that detent in place and I can't get the knife to hardly deploy at all. Okay, so that's what how the detent works on a lot of knives. Now, not every single one. For example, this one achieves detent in a very, very different way. And I'm not going to go into a huge, long discussion about this. I have that discussion in my initial review of the standard 830 Marksman. But that ball in that little cup, right, it has to, the geometry of that, the amount of ball that kind of sticks up, and the how round or how squared off the edges of that cup are, that has to be designed just right to give enough detent that in order to get the ball to break free of the cup, you end up generating enough force. So I start pushing on this, and I'm slowly moving that ball in the cup, and then when it releases, it needs to be enough force to deploy the blade, okay? And so basically when it comes to detent, that's all I'm really looking for. Now there will be personal preferences, okay? Some people prefer, this knife does not have a very stiff detent. It's still plenty strong enough to deploy the blade quickly, right? There's gonna be a matter of personal preference here, right? Where some people want a slightly softer detent, some people want a stiffer detent. A lot of DTs are known to have a pretty stiff detent. And that kind of started, by the way, with the 0560. If you have been around that long, you probably remember the discussions of guys saying, oh man, the lockup is too stiff and I can't deploy the knife. And very quickly other people started saying, wait a second, this stiff detent is a really good idea because it makes the blade really deploy quickly. This is the Rexford Zero Tolerance 804. And so that became kind of a thing, okay? And now a lot of ZTs have super stiff detents. I would say a good example of a knife that gets it really right is the Real Steel S571. This is one of the nicest actions that I own. And I own some really expensive knives. This has just the most amazing action. It's smooth, it's super fast, and the detent is essentially perfect, okay? It's not too stiff. It's not too soft that you ever have a hard time deploying, or that you ever have the blade not wanting to fully engage. It's just really, really dialed in, and that's essentially what we're looking for. Okay, and so that's detent. When I look for detent, I'm talking about I want it to be strong enough that the blade deploys every time without me having to put a lot of thought into it. A knife like this, you got to remember what knife you're flipping, and you've got to put a little bit of effort into it every time. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Now, what else do I care about in flippers? Well, let me show you a few of the knives that I've got here, and hopefully you can notice something, okay? Notice the flipper tab on this one. Notice the flipper tab on this one. Notice the flipper tab on this one, okay? Again, here's another good example, right? Then we have this flipper tab, or this flipper tab. No, this one's still fairly good, but this one is another good example. And of course, if you remember, if you've seen my video on the Ferrum Forge Ferox, it has the most exaggerated example of this, with the exception of the Medford. I'm trying to think of what's the Medford. Someone comment below. There's a Medford knife that has like this crazy, stupid long flipper on it that looks absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, you get where I'm going with this. I like the flipper tab to not be super huge. All of the knives I've shown you, or a number of the knives demonstrate that it doesn't have to be, right? This knife has a fairly small flipper tab overall, and it flips really well, okay? The same is true of the Rexford, okay? Same is true of the Lion Steel, right? You don't need this giant flipper tab protruding out the back of the knife. You can get really good flipping action with a smaller flipper tab, and I definitely prefer that. It's more comfortable in the pocket. If you're carrying the knife in the pocket with other stuff, this is a great example of a flipper tab that can easily catch on things. It's a hook, right? So it can easily catch. Give you a perfect example. It literally will work just like a hook, okay? So I'm not really into that. I mean, it's not a deal breaker for me, but I definitely prefer the smaller flipper tab over the larger, all right? So what else? Well, we want the geometry to be right. So now all of these are different examples, okay? But I'm gonna tell you the one that I prefer. And let's see, this one, this one, this one. Okay, if I show you, notice the relationship between the pivot screw and the flipper. This is, if I put my finger here, this is about where the pivot screw comes through, and notice the flipper tab is above it. Same with this one, right? Same with this one. This one's not as much above, it's just a teeny bit. This one, same thing. Okay, and that gives you a little better leverage on the blade. A knife like this doesn't have that. Now this blade is fine because it overcomes that less than ideal geometry by having a longer tab, by having a good detent and a fairly heavy blade. So the blade, once it gets a little bit of momentum, it's going to swing into place because of the weight of that blade. Okay, and even this one is fairly, it's at the very least level with the pivot screw, maybe even a slight bit higher. All right, and that's one of the things that makes for a good action, is having good leverage on that blade, so that you've got a bit of distance that you can really push down with your finger. Okay, so geometry matters, size matters, okay, detent matters. What about smoothness? Now that's something that, again, you're going to see differences in different levels of quality. This knife, okay, it will drop free, but it's fairly, you know, there's quite a bit of friction here. The knife, notice if I let go of it, right, it stays where it is. Another kind of opposite example is if I let go of this blade, right, it falls. And even more exaggerated is this knife, where it almost has no friction at all. Now, in this particular design, that's okay because you do not have to get your fingers in the way of the blade at all to close the knife. So that extreme lack of friction, like this blade just drops, is acceptable in this design. In this design, where it still drops pretty quickly, you better be a little bit careful, because that blade you do have to put your fingers in front of the blade in order to close this knife. Now, I use the flipper mechanism as sort of a safety stop. It hits my thumb, and then I close it, and that's how you'll see a lot of guys use flippers. And that's, by the way, why the Apostle gets so bent out of shape over this. This is where the detent ball is now sitting on top of the lock bar, and this one isn't bad because it still closes nicely, but some knives you actually have to go and re-extend the lock bar to get it to close, and that is a minor annoyance for me as well. Again, this knife, the 0571, gets it exactly right. Like, it just, there's nothing that this knife, all of these things that I'm describing, this knife pretty well does them right. You know, this knife has the best of sort of all of these things that I'm talking about. So next, how smooth is it, right? So we've talked about how free it is. This one's very free. This one's much less free, okay? But both of them are actually very smooth. The action on this, you don't feel, you know, you can feel a little bit of friction, but it's very clean. It's very precise, okay? Again, even this one, this doesn't have ball bearings, but again, it's very clean feeling. It's very smooth feeling. This knife is a good example of one that is not so smooth. And a lot of the, if you remember the Kaiser Roach, it was on bearings, and some of the more budget-friendly knives that are on bearings, they're not as smooth. That is, when you do this, you can actually feel the ball bearings rolling, okay? And I don't like feeling those balls. I know, right? That's what she said. But I don't like feeling the ball bearings rolling inside the knife. That's not what I call smooth, okay? Now the movement of this blade is right, okay? They've got the movement dialed in, so just a little shake and it closes nicely, flips really well, but it's not quite as smooth. And I do have a drop of oil in this pivot, which will often make that go away. Sometimes if you feel those ball bearings rolling, it can mean there's a little bit of dirt and crud in there, especially a knife new from factory. You think about a factory, think about the dirt and the steel shavings and the exhaust fumes and all the crap that's in a typical factory, and that's going to be in the pivot of your knife when you first get it. And so spray it out, a little bit of WD-40 in there, or even take the knife apart. Now be careful if it's non-caged ball bearings. That is, if they're just free floating around in there, taking your knife apart, be very, very careful. Take it apart in a pie plate or something so you don't lose any of the little ball bearings. But just be aware, a lot of knives, especially right from the factory, they're going to be a little rough and you'll have to clean out that pivot a little bit. So we've talked about freeness, how well the blade folds. We've talked about smoothness, how consistent and how smooth and flat it feels. Finally, I don't want it to stick. Now, this is a knife that sometimes, because of the Teflon, can stick just a little bit. It's not too bad, but even when you oil a knife, that can cause a little bit of stickiness to the action. All right. By the way, a lot of these knives, I have adjusted the pivot tension to exactly where I want it and then Loctited it at that point. And that's a good practice. I recommend anyone do that. However, keep in mind that the oil, that when you do that, if you then go ahead and oil that pivot, the oil may get into the screw and destroy or fight against the Loctite that you put in there. You've got a screw there, you're trying to get it not to spin, and then you lubricate it, which is going to make it spin easier. Okay, so be aware that when you do that, you may want to use a little thicker oil. You may want to take the knife apart and put the oil exactly where you want it on the washer or on the bearings. Just take some steps, because and probably you've had this too, but I've had lots of knives where I've set the tension exactly where I want it, don't want to touch it again, but then oil it, and of course get a little too much oil and it ends up in the screw. And now my Loctite is defeated, and when you take the screw apart, you can see how much oil you actually got in there. And then what you have to do, this is how I do it now. I oil the knife, I use it, I get the oil fully worked into the knife, then I take the pivot screw out, I clean inside of it with a paper towel and with a baby wipe, which really, really sucks up the oil, and then do my Loctite, put the screw in, and set it where I want it. So that's my discussion of flippers. We've talked about what makes a good flipper, what features we're looking for, and what kind of things, what thought process is going through my head when I'm telling you guys, hey, this is a great flipper, or this is a not so great flipper, or this is really smooth, or it's not so smooth. All of those things are things that I look for and that I think about when I think about, hey, does this knife flip really well? Is it well engineered, well designed, does it perform the way that I expect it to? There you go, guys. I'd love to hear in the comments below what you look for. Are there some things here that you just hate? Maybe a free dropping blade is not what you want, or maybe a free dropping blade is absolutely what you want. So I'll look for your kind of preferences in the comments below, and we will talk to you later.